Меня зовут Надежда Шаламова. Я родилась в Томской области, Россия. А, Я использую свое короткое имя Надя. So my name is Nadezhda Shalamova. That's my full name. Okay, I go by my short name, Nadya, and I was born in the Tomsk Oblast, Russia. Well, Siberia, Russia. My family history. So my great grandparents were exiled to Siberia in 1930, 1931 during the Stalinist, repressions, but they were teenagers, I would say, at that time, along with my, great grandparents. So my great great grandparents, and they originally came to that Altai region in the early 1900s. Okay, when and I don't know how many listeners are familiar with the Stolypin reform. So it was an agriculture series of agricultural reforms in Russia, like around 1905. That the purpose of that reform was to modernize, Russia. Like a lot of Siberian territory was not like really heavily occupied at that time, so they ended up in that they were allowed to, buy land, establish their own, farms, and pretty much do whatever they. It's like Western, like wild west here. During the population different settlements in the United States. So, but anyway, they came there. Most of the people who ended up in that little settlement were of the Ukrainian origin. So there were a lot of Ukrainians. So like on my great parents are have Ukrainian roots. But when they were exiled from what was at that time their home, again 1930s. I think my granddad was 1930, and my grandma was a little bit year later, 1931. So they were exiled to. They were put on a barge. It was a lot of people. There is no roof, nothing. You're just basically in the open air, and they traveled, several days to this like a very remote place in, in Siberia, and basically left on the riverbank to either survive or to die. So, but lots of people died on that barge, while they were traveling. Just many people were, of course, just kind of completely not used to, the circumstances that in which they found themselves. But my grandparents, their families survived, and luckily, I suppose at that time, considering the circumstances, they ended up being sort of left. They were left on near the native or indigenous, small indigenous people settlement, to kind of a village, I suppose you could call them. And my granddad always attributed, those indigenous people to their survival, because he turned out to be, really good at hunting and understanding the forest and understanding that really new and foreign way of life. So they were farmers, so they didn't know anything about hunting or mushrooms, so berry picking, stuff like that. So, but by the time I was born, so this settlement that was kind of established with the people who were exiled from different parts of Russia. Okay, at that time, it completely merged with the the native or indigenous people. And by the way, that group of people was called the Hanti. And this is where I first encountered, as a child, um, some of the native Siberian or native indigenous people. And um, I did not actually realize that until way later, because everyone, like, there were people from all parts of Russia at that time, and of course there were this native indigenous population, but there were also lots of people from other parts of Russia, including actually when I grew up, when my parents, especially my mom, grew up there. including people German people who were sent there after World War II, those who were captured. So the settlement that kind of we ended up in was called Milgino. It's kind of a small, now became a small village, again, in the Tomsk Oblast. It's the region actually known for, very rich natural resources, very diverse landscapes, and it's kind of the southern part of West Siberian plain. Okay, this is where it's located. And as I said, both my parents ended up in that place. They were teenagers at that time, but this is where they met. Okay, this is where they, yeah, this is where they, got married. This is where they, established their family. And I lived there until I was 7, or just shortly, before 7. So we left that village. My parents and my brother and me. We left for the big city. That's a city that's called Tomsk. Okay, to go basically to go to school. Okay, because my parents and my grandparents, always wanted to provide good education, and the school that existed in the village at that time was not enough. Was not enough. So that's how I ended up in a bigger city. But what I do remember about that village is some of the memories that kind of stuck with me is that before we left, I remember kind of a lot of explosions on the other side of the river. Yes, and it's like you might be wondering why. But like maybe a decade or a couple before that, so they discovered like a big deposits of natural gas and oil, okay, near that village. And so I remember that we had to leave our house, and our house was really close to the river because they did a lot of, I suppose, tests at that time on the other side of the river. And we had to, I just remember old people would leave their house and we have to walk, like, pretty far just to be, to be in a safe location. And that village exists today, and it's basically one of the largest companies in Russia. It's kind of one of the world's biggest exporter of natural gas, called Gazprom. Okay, is still there, and so that's kind of stuck to me. Those explosions. Um, but to me, to me, that village was like, I did not like the place, to be honest with you. So my mom, of course, and her sister and her brothers, they remember that place with a lot of warmth, right, and love. This is where their childhood, when this is where they um, my grandparents, their parents were. But to me, it was a sad place. I have to say, because even as a child, I clearly remember how lives were ruined by exile. That people who were, again, came from uh, different parts of Russia who had never been in the taiga, for example, this thick forest, who were they were exiled from cities. There were scientists, there were teachers, there were doctors. So, but yeah, a lot of people sort of lost their sense of identity. People froze to death in the taiga or in the marshes. People killed by wild animals. So I remember that we had to bolt, uh, all the doors in the house because a wild bear would be walking the streets of the village, and you would wake up and to a tragedy. Because like someone who maybe wasn't very careful, or maybe was under the influence, let's say, or did not maybe lock their doors, that someone would be killed. And Yeah, it wasn't really a good place. It was a very good place to me for me, and like I don't go back there, with like my memories thinking about, I think I had a good childhood because I had a lot of love in the family, but I did not really like that place. Okay, I had to go back there after we left for sort of a summer holidays because that's what is a thing to do. People were, again, those families who were lucky enough maybe to have their parents living somewhere in the country. Often children would be shipped over, there for just good air, organic food, and safe environment. um, but I remember I dreaded those trips to the village because you had to travel like on a boat and then an airplane that was, I swear, done before, was manufactured before World War II. So they were very small, they were very stinky, they were very uncomfortable, and they flew really, really low. So I remember looking out of the window, and I'm also prone to motion sickness. To me, it would be like, an hour of puking essentially. But I remember, like, I look at the window and all you see is this taiga and marshes, taiga and marshes. So, um, um, I, I probably, yes, I did learn some things, from valuable things, from my childhood there. um, but it's not the place that I remember with love. I was in Tomsk. I got there before, before I went to, like you went to school. So I was about 7 years old, and I ended up in this city, as I said, Tomsk. Um, this city is actually known at that time, was known for its rich cultural and atmosphere. It was and still is a home to several universities, community colleges, theaters, art galleries. I remember that every weekend we would go to either to the movies or a theater play or some kind of a sport event. Or some kind of a performances. So like I remember we were always busy, so at that time my parents owned sort of like a condominium, I suppose you can describe it, in a newly constructed building that also located in a recently developed neighborhood. So there were a lot of new people there. Everything was new and clean, and I think this provided us with a comfortable place to live and a sense of stability during my childhood. But I did walk to school as everyone else did. There were no school buses. And again, luckily, I did not live that far away. But I remember, school was not canceled in winter when it was cold. It all became very tough because we had to wait. I remember that. School was canceled only when it was like 30, minus 38 centigrade. If it's 35, 36, you go to school and it's cold. And by the time you get to the school, to school or to the building, your eyelashes are frozen and your eyebrows are frozen. So, yeah, it was, I don't know, I think maybe it was just made me tougher. So I always make fun of the school cancellations here in Milwaukee. Yeah, you walk to school and you walk back. I was parents worked, so you get home all by yourself. You get into the apartment, or you by yourself. You warm up some food. You do homework. We only have one television program at that time. So I think a lot of us, well, I read pretty much. That was my main, kind of an entertainment, at that time. Um, so again, I think that for many years kind of felt comfortable in there, and liked my life. And but when I was 14, a tragedy struck out our family. My father went on one of the hunting trips and never came back. As far as we know, he perished in the taiga. So, and he was the main bread winner essentially in the family. So after, he never came back, my mom became a sole provider. Naturally, my grandparents helped, but I remember the life changed, and life changed, drastically. And those years also sort of coincided with the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So just remember there was a widespread lack of food. We spent a lot of time in lines, for like to a grocery store, for example, for um, sugar or um, just for a lot of things, essentially for everything, for everything. And I also remember there were several years where uh, people, including my mom, simply were not paid. So there was absolutely no money. And luckily for us, like we avoided starvation because my grandparents again lived in the village, and they were able to send us food on those big trucks that traveled from that village to Tomsk during the winter months. And we also again luckily had our apartment had a really big balcony, and we used it as a refrigerator. So you go to the balcony, I remember, to just to get food, meat, and all kinds of canned foods. And my grandmother would send us even loaf of breads and things like that. So, but I do remember that it was a very tough time for a lot of people. And I know that many people just did not have enough to eat. I would say that I grew up with a belief and kind of an encouragement that education was vital, was key for both men and women. So achieving, like, getting higher education, going to college, for example, or getting postdoctoral degree, or doctoral or postdoctoral degree was just clearly considered to be a mark of, status and respect in the community. Um, for me, I don't know. I many people I know of my generation, or even my parents' generation who are, still alive, often look back at on the Soviet Union with a sense of nostalgia. And I know that many people remember it very fondly because there was free healthcare, free education, free childcare, free, any sort of a post school programs for kids were free, and seemed to have like kind of a both equal opportunities, for everyone, including, men and women, if we're just talking about genders. And I think for a lot of people, uh, and I'm talking about women as well, those social benefits were definitely an important part of kind of this daily life, and they contributed, I think, for many people to the feelings of security and, and stability. But I also remember that life in the Soviet Union was just to be restrictive, as many other kids, I suppose, or younger people, I was subjected to propaganda. But I was always kind of a curious person that questioned a lot of things around me, and just had a really keen sense of kind of a double standards of those, especially, like people in power. But when it comes to, again, women of my generation, either before or during the Soviet Union, again, the women had equal rights. We had the right to vote. The woman had the right to divorce. Abortion was legalized. Women were again encouraged to pursue careers but in certain fields, I have to say, like, teaching, medicine, maybe journalism, science, but God forbid engineering, because, girls don't have apparently the brains for engineering, or maybe law. Um, so again, the environment that I grew up in was that everyone went to college, or like the majority of people went to college, and there was no distinction whether you're a woman or you're a man. And I would say that was a kind of a progressive stance on women's rights, but I also have to acknowledge that women definitely face this kind of an ongoing challenge of balancing their careers with domestic responsibilities, because there was this definite pressure from society that expected women to handle the majority of housework, cooking, and especially childcare, and a kind of a double burden, I would say. That double burden meant that women often endured kind of long hours at a very maybe demanding job, only to come home to a second shift, let's say, and to do household chores, make dinner, make sure kids are okay, homework is done, and things like that. So this is what I remember about women after the collapse of the Soviet Union, probably even actually later, when this is kind of a new Russia, I would say, at that time, that a lot of women got the opportunity to pursue the entrepreneurial interest. And a lot of women became very successful, because, like I said, in general, women were encouraged and many pursued, higher education, not just high school or even community college, but many went to what got their masters. It was kind of a standard, I would say. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, yeah, lots of women, opened their own businesses, became successful entrepreneurs, especially again, if their husbands had connections, let's say. um, but yeah, I think for a lot of women, it was kind of a welcome change. Man and woman could occupy, the same position, but of course, a man would be paid more. But in terms of, like I said, there were certain professions maybe where women considered to be like outsiders, right? Like, again, engineering was not for women. But women also work in construction. Women worked in transportation. Uh, so I don't know. I grew up with the sense that yeah, I could go anywhere if I had the brain for it. Lots of women had their own careers. It actually was looked down, frowned upon if you were sort of a homestay mom. So that wasn't something that definitely was not an aspirational path. Okay, for a woman. I went to college and grad school in Tomsk, so the city that we moved in, after we left the village. And so I got into a program in linguistics, and I worked in um, it's called as a laboratory of the Siberian indigenous people. Okay, that laboratory still exists. They still conduct linguistic research. And I worked primarily. So I did several field trips for the course of 3 years, just a month. About like each field trip was about a month, and I worked with the community, the indigenous community known as Hanti. As I mentioned, this is the population. This is native indigenous people that my great parents and grandparents encountered, when they first, came to that part of Siberia. So my linguistic research was, um, I don't know if it would be interesting to your readers or listeners. It was focus on the category of aspect. It's a grammatical aspect, in the Hunter language. But uh, I think that what I need to say is that was that I studied not just language. I studied the specific dialect of that language, one of the
Hmm.
archaic dialects of that language that was going extinct at that time. Okay, and it had a very interesting kind of a grammatical structure, and surprisingly, the dialect almost was almost like an independent language, because there were some other dialects of that language that were spoken in other parts of Siberia, but this particular dialect was very close to the Hungarian language. Surprise, surprise. Like somewhere in Europe, right? And as I said, that was, it had only a few speakers left. And I studied that language because, again, I had lived in that village. So I kind of really had a pretty good idea about, where to go, who to talk to. I had my, relatives still lived in that area. And, it wasn't the first time when I went on the field trip. It wasn't the first time when I just encountered the indigenous people. So I knew about their life, and I would say that my observations throughout those years were that the Soviet Union definitely kind of brought some technical and scientific knowledge and literacy, because everyone had to go to school. Every indigenous child, including the indigenous children, they had to go to school. Everyone had to learn how to write, how to, you basically, an expectation was that you graduated from school. You have to do at least 10 grades. I think this is what we're required to do. So, but to me, again, as a linguist and an anthropologist of that time, I have to say that the sense of identity, that was lost. The sense of identity, cultural identity, linguistic identity, because again, women married Russian or Russian-speaking men. Again, remember, we're talking about the place where people from all parts of the Soviet Union had been, sent to, not only during the Stalin's repressions, but also after World War II. As I said, there were Germans, there were Ukrainians, there were Belarusians, there were people from the Baltic, what used to be like called Baltic Republic. Just the world. I heard different languages, and I grew up in different cultures, which I did not realize until I got to the United States, pretty much, that I was very comfortable, with cultural and linguistic diversity. But I also know that the the native culture pretty much did not survive. As far as I know, pretty much the dialect is gone, and I'm very proud of the work that I did and that was able to document, that language. I actually had a couple of grants. So one was, well, we actually received two big grants from the Russian Science Foundation for that work. I also got a grant from Carnegie Foundation. The majority of Hantu people live in the northern part of Siberia. It's called the Khanty-Mansi territory. So they maintain their cultural identity and the language. But it's a kind of this dialect was an isolate, So there were was a very, very small community of people. And of course, everyone was interested, and still is, how come it is so close to the Hungarian language and not that close to the other dialects of the same language. And it's really fascinating, research. But because the community was so small at that time, and again, so they basically kind of got diluted in this Russian-speaking population. I do not think that it is viable or feasible at this point, to completely resurrect that dialect in that particular place. For indigenous women, I think that again, some of them definitely took sort of advantage of this new educational opportunities, right? But that was a big, was a like, really dramatic shift in their way of life. So while they pursued their, education and embraced their new cultural identity, of course, many of them lost their language and also lost their cultural identity. I know that some of them in Russian passports at that time, and I think even still, you would write. So you were required to actually declare uh, your national identity, I suppose, right? So I know that some people, some indigenous people, would want to be kind of declared as Russians, not Hunty, for example. So I think that there was also a lot of stigma around, indigenous people because again, their way of life was just very different from the mainstream way of life that again that Russian speaking population or other cultures that came in there. They were more, I suppose, like I don't know, more Russian, more westernized, maybe, right? So, but I think it was, and I really, it was kind of one of the main reasons I um, did not continue pursue this work because I think it was happening in front of my eyes, how the culture was dying. When I have conversations like that, I think it just makes me appreciate things that I did not maybe see before, did not realize, or didn't value before. Like I think that life gave me really good sense, not a skill that I would call adaptability, you know? So adaptability, being able to adapt sort of a quickly, assess your kind of a surroundings, your circumstances, and think, well, how can I survive? That's one. But then not only how can I survive, but how can I flourish? And I just remember that was kind of a mantra that we had in my family, and especially my granddad. You just never give up. You never give up. You toughen up. That you can't because in those circumstances you can because you'll be dead in a few hours. So I think that maybe again this adaptability and sort of becoming tough, I would say, maybe like tougher than other maybe even women, who were happened to be or happened to grow up in more kind of a softer, let's say, circumstances. So there was that. And I remember again when I came to the United States, I actually came to California for the first time. I felt like really, really comfortable. Again, people were speaking different languages. Of course, I mean, I couldn't understand Spanish, at that time, but I was just very comfortable with diversity, basically. Okay, that's kind of one of the things to me. It's cultural diversity, like ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity, just any kind of okay, there are always, there is no one correct thing. Okay. Uh, like there are always multiple perspectives, right? And you somehow need to find out a way to live there, right? And live well. So I think those are kind of the main takeaways, for me.